Hi folks, Robert Lowell Goller here. Thank you for joining me for our weekly chat about local history. I'm back in my home office and live again. For those who are watching live, most of you don't, that's okay. But I will be back on the road to some interesting locations in the near future. So thanks for that suggestion for people who give me ideas of where to go in the community. Um, did you know that New York State had its own census for quite some time? Even I, a historian who uses this information all the time and is a researcher all the time, I forget sometimes that New York State had its own census. And an interesting story popped up recently. I was researching other things and came across, I tend to look back 100 years ago, 50 years ago to try to find some interesting things on the milestone years. And that was the case. And I was looking back 100 years ago, and there was an article in the Easter Advertiser about warning folks, telling them that census enumerators would be coming around and that please answer your door to answer the questions. And I thought, 1925, that's not a year that a census is taken. So I thought that was quite odd. Usually the censuses, and you hear a lot about the federal censuses, they come around in the 0 years, every 10 years, ending with a 0. So I thought it was odd until I read further, and they didn't really explicitly say, so you had to wait till like the last paragraph to realize it was the state census, that New York State census enumerators would be coming around, which is different than the federal census that is done every 10 years on the 0 years, and we still do it. Well, what we often forget, and people often forget when they're doing research, that there is the New York State Census, which could be helpful to their research, genealogy particularly. And we often forget about it. I even forget about it sometimes when I'm going through the list of resources that we could be using. And that was the case that came up most recently when I was caught off guard by this census in 1925 when I forgot that there was a state census. Well, 1925 was the last state census. But before 1925, including the year 1925, you can get some limited information. But why did we have a state census? Well, going back to the first New York State Constitution in 1777, the state constitution required a census every 7 years. Now, it didn't always happen nicely. So when you look back at the early censuses, it might seem like they were random years. 1795, 1807, 1814, 1821. They don't seem like nice, clean years, like one's ending in 0 or one's ending in 5. But that was because they were being taken every 7 years. And the reason that New York State did a census of its own, in addition to the information that they wanted to get, is New York State used that census information for allocating assembly districts, Senate districts in New York State. They did not rely on the U.S. Census in order to make the districts for the state legislature and state offices. So they used its own census. So that was the case in the early years that from the first Constitution in 1777 through 1825, the census was every 7 years or so. For 1825, in the early 1820s, actually to be specific, 1821, New York State voted to change the Constitution, and they made it so that they changed the date of the state census. So beginning in 1820, they first of all said there will be a census in 1825, and then there will be every 10 years after that. So what ended up happening is you would have a state census on the years with the 5 and a federal census on the year with the 0. And so both were every 10 years, but they were on alternating years. So what is really neat about this is that a lot of things happen in 10 years, right? Even back then, even when life was slower. So sometimes people get frustrated, even when either at my job or when I'm researching, where you see someone moved from one place in 1890 and they were someplace else in 1900. But what you don't know is, were they anywhere in between? And again, people can move multiple times in 10 years. Their occupations could change a lot in 10 years. So a lot of information is needed sometimes, could be helpful within the 10-year gaps between censuses. And so the New York State Census can help fill that gap. And you can find information in between the U.S. censuses. So keep that in mind if you're doing genealogy research and you want to know where people were in between the U.S. federal censuses, which a lot of us know. The federal censuses generally, I think people know about those, but the state census isn't necessarily, New York State Census isn't necessarily widely known as a resource. One of the problems with the state census is a lot of them don't have a great deal of information. Actually, the early ones only included the head of household, the man, the father in general, most of the time. And then they started adding other family members. And in some years, they just only had like 5 or 6 questions. So there wasn't really a whole lot of information to be gleaned from the census. However, if you know that someone was married to someone else and you know who the head of household was, you can figure out where they were living at the time. So there is some very interesting information. It just would be nice if there was more information on some of those early New York State censuses. Now, how do you get these? They're not all available. Not all the information is there. I won't put the links in because you can literally just Google search engine New York State Census and find out all the information you want to know. Libraries and the New York State government actually have resources to get to those New York State censuses, so you can go that route if you're looking for the New York State Census to complement the federal census. Some of the websites like Ancestry.com and Family Search, they also have links to the New York State Census or what is available of the New York State Census. Now, not all years between, 1825 to 1925, there was a census every 10 years, except in 1880, the governor decided that he wasn't going to spend state money on a census, which actually was unconstitutional, I believe, according to I'm not a lawyer, but it seems unconstitutional because the state constitution required a New York State census, and the governor objected to it and did not support it. So they didn't conduct a census in 1885. So the 1880 census was used for the purposes of what would happen in the 1885 census. And the governor had said that he didn't think it was necessary to spend money on a state census because the federal census was already extravagant enough and provided enough information that the New York State didn't have to spend all this money. Now, censuses are expensive. If you think about that, the amount of money that they would have spent even today, still sending out the surveys, back then going door to door, paying people to go door to door to collect this information is how they used to do it. They still do if you don't send back your form for the U.S. federal census. And so it was expensive. So they didn't do one in 1880. Well, and then later censuses became very vague. They didn't have necessarily where specific places where people were born, just the country where they were born. So it just really depends. The census, New York State Census, didn't get better with time. So it really depends on which year you're looking at, whether you get lucky enough to have more information than not. And that can all be, if you Google New York State censuses, you can find out what information is there for which years. Now, what ended up happening is the 1925 census became the last one. So 100 years ago, the notice that I noticed in the Easter Advertiser for census enumerators, that was the last one for New York State. They changed the Constitution again and got rid of the New York State Census. Basically saying, the argument was, we already have a federal census, we don't need to be spending the money on a state census as well. And so the apportionment of the Senate and Assembly districts, things like that, for state purposes, used the U.S. Census for most intents and for most purposes. So 1925 is the last one. So you won't find one in 35, 45, 55. You have to rely on the federal census for that. Now, why censuses are important for many reasons. We have phone books today. We have city directories from the 1800s on that are a lot of times helpful. However, not everyone had a telephone, and sometimes when they started transferring from directories to phone books, if you didn't have a phone, you didn't necessarily get listed. And there's also phone books. A lot of times include spouses' names, children's names, country of origin, or where you were born, age. Or the phone books will have occupations, things like that. Surprisingly, a lot of information for a phone book, but they don't include the things like where you were born, your ages, your children's names all the time. So censuses are really important, especially in the pre-phone book era, to find out where people were, where they were living at the time, and what they were doing, and who they were related to. And also, old maps are used quite often. We have a lot of maps from the 1800s that were published, atlases. However, a lot of those maps show owners of property. And even today, not everyone owns land. So if you didn't own land back then, you didn't end up on a map. So a census didn't care whether you owned property or not. The census taker wanted to know everybody's name, regardless if you were a renter or if you owned the land. And in many cases, they would say whether you were renting or you were owning the land. So we can get that information today, and it's very useful. So the census is really helpful, I think, for people who may not necessarily have owned land. The people who don't show up, didn't pay taxes, didn't pay property taxes, they wouldn't end up on the property tax list or on the property lists, the maps, those great atlases we have from 1855, 1880, 1866. We have some great atlases, but if you didn't own the land, you're not gonna be shown on those maps. And the censuses are very important for that. So don't forget about the New York State Census. If you, particularly between that 100 years of 1825 to 1925, if you are looking for somebody, don't forget that there is another census that's available for you. Again, not all the information is there, and some years are duds. I'll be honest. I tried to look up some people, and I'm like, either it's not there, or the information is so limited it really wasn't helpful. But it's another thing to check off when you're doing genealogy and researching. So don't forget that we had censuses for New York State in addition to the United States Census. So again, thank you for these great ideas. Thank you for listening in. These videos are also available on YouTube. I've had some people say that they don't like to watch on Facebook, so I post them on YouTube right away as fast as I can. And also Facebook has been taking down live videos, so I may be doing fewer live videos because they can stay up longer on as regular videos. At least for now, Facebook isn't doing that, taking them down. So if you have any ideas or comments or questions, feel free to pop them in the comments or send me a private message. Get a lot of those. Thank you for that. Again, I am Robert Lowell Goller, and I am the Town and Village Historian, but these videos and a lot of my research, my upcoming books on the history of East Aurora are not officially connected to my duties as Town and Village Historian. So we have a movie being filmed in East Aurora this week, so there's quite a lot of excitement. Maybe I'll talk about that coming up. Some news on that front may be coming, and the other ideas as well coming up there. Just a little teaser. I've been researching fluoride in water. I got a question about when fluoride was added. There's been some discussion in some cities about whether they should be taking fluoride out of the public water system. That topic's come up again. And so I thought, oh, I'll take a look at see when East Aurora got its first fluoride in the water, and so that's going to be an upcoming topic. Thanks to someone who had talked about it with me out on in an aisle at the grocery store. So I'll be talking about that coming up. So again, thank you for keeping history alive. Thank you for supporting my projects.